Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Maralia Negron. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy Advocacy and Research here at the network. We're very excited to be starting off Domestic Violence Awareness Month with our Measuring Safety report. This report is specifically focused on gender-based violence services in Illinois for 2024. So we'll be taking a statewide look at services provided both by domestic and sexual violence service providers throughout Illinois. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to our presenters today, the phenomenal team that I work with to put this together. So I'll turn it over to Shelby and Imuna to get us started on the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Maralia. We'll do quick intros here at the top. My name is Shelby Hoffman Binder. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as Policy Advocacy and Research Manager, and I'll pass it to Imuna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Imuna McQuicklin. I am the Data and Research Associate for the Policy Advocacy and Research team.
All right. With intros out of the way, we'll go ahead and dive in. It is a jam-packed presentation for our hour together today. And we're really grateful to have you all here, especially, as Maralia said, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So just to give you a quick roadmap of where we're going today, we have some baseline introductory information for anybody who is new to the network or to measuring safety as a project. Then we'll pivot and talk a little bit about domestic violence services in the state. We'll talk about who the clients are receiving those services, as well as give a detailed breakdown on what those services actually are. And then we will also shift to talking about sexual violence services. So that will include both the clients who receive services and details on those services themselves. Let's go ahead and dive into that introductory information. For anyone who is perhaps unfamiliar with the network Advocating Against Domestic Violence is a membership-based organization. We lead a coalition of direct service organizations who are all working to end gender-based violence. And we do that in a lot of different ways. First and foremost, we are the proud operators of the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, which reaches survivors across the state and beyond 24/7, 365. We also provide other direct supportive resources to survivors through programs like our Survivor Fund, which issues cash payments and other forms of financial assistance to survivors. We also support our member organizations through a number of different avenues, primarily through professional development, training, and technical assistance to ensure that everybody in our field has the knowledge and the resources they need to do this work and to do it well. Here on the Policy Advocacy and Research team, our goal is to always advocate for policies that support survivors and the orgs that serve them, to ensure that everybody has equitable access to the things that they need. Measuring safety is one of several ways we do that. We also have a policy advocacy presence locally here in Chicago, at the county level, and statewide in Springfield. What is measuring safety? You may ask. Well, measuring safety is an annual data report series that we've been publishing at the network since 2020. And it's really intended to help us assess experiences of gender-based violence and how responding service providers operate here in Illinois. The goal of these reports is really to learn from survivors and providers about the nature of violence, the gaps in our services and systems, and steps that are needed to repair harm and prevent future violence. Measuring safety, we often like to say, is a snapshot, a contemporary snapshot of whatever the issue at hand is. Of course, today we're talking about services, but we might also look at who calls the hotline or who accesses our survivor fund, or even taking a look at what policies have passed in the last year. All of that is usually going to be on a 1 year or a 3 year trend timeline. So we're looking pretty narrowly at a moment in time in these reports. And we are not conducting a scientific study in these reports, which means that when we look at trends, we aren't really able to draw causal conclusions, though we rely on a mix of quantitative and qualitative sources to offer some hypotheses when we notice trends to try to contextualize them for you as the reader. We like to pitch measuring safety to our members as a tool for advocacy, for fundraising, and for public education. And for all of you here today, I hope you find that you can leave here with measuring safety being a similar tool for you. This report, our services report, relies on two primary sources, and we want to give you a quick once-over of what those are. The first and major quantitative source of data is InfoNet, which many of our service providers in the room will know is a web-based database system that's operated and hosted by the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. It's a system that was actually co-created and is somewhat co-managed by domestic violence and sexual assault service providers across the state. And it allows them to record data about their services and the clients who receive them. ICEJA then will allow aggregated data from that database to be released to other entities like the network so that we can analyze what services look like across the state. It's aggregated data, which means it has some limitations, and we want to kind of give you those limitations at the top of our call. First and foremost, not every category of data that can be entered in InfoNet is required and is filled out. Many categories are required by grantors, for example, and are going to have really universally high reporting rates because of that, whereas others might actually have pretty low reporting rates. To sort of account for the fact that low reporting rates don't necessarily give us super consistent information, we report the reporting rate throughout the document and throughout today's presentation as well. Of course, the other thing to note is that not all domestic violence and sexual assault service providers use InfoNet or use it to reflect all of their services. Some organizations may use InfoNet for the services that require it. For example, if a grantor requires it for a counseling program, for example, they might use InfoNet for that program and record the rest of their services in a different database. Similarly, there are lots of new or small or culturally responsive orgs that perhaps don't use InfoNet at all. Perhaps they're not receiving a grant that requires them to use it. And in that case, their clients are not represented here. Given that, we encourage folks to listen to all of the numbers we talk about today and consider them an underestimate, because we know there are other services being provided to survivors that are not reflected in today's report. There is, of course, a priority around maintaining client and organizational privacy in an aggregated data set like this. So in cases where a data category has a really low response rate, that number will be kept confidential from us. We indicate those throughout the report and are another way in which this is sort of a known underestimate. Lastly, InfoNet is a tool that is used really widely, but that means that every individual user might interact with it a little differently. So we know and want to recognize that different orgs might use a different approach for recording hours of their services. InfoNet issues guidance, definitions for how to use terms, and recommendations related to recording hours of service. But we know there's variance in that, and we can just sort of keep that in our mind when we look at some of our hours data in particular. The other major source of information, particularly our qualitative information, comes from survivor interviews. Every year, we conduct 90-minute anonymous interviews via Zoom with survivors who are willing to share their story, and we do pay them for their time. These are such compelling pieces of the puzzle of understanding gender-based violence services, the power of those services, and the limits of those services. And we think their voices are a really essential part of the project. We want to let you know in advance that we are going to be reading some of their stories out in full today. And while there's nothing graphic in those conversations, we are going to be touching on and articulating some really painful stories. These include, of course, a wide variety of experiences of sexual and domestic violence. They will also touch on themes around suicidal ideation. We want you to know that that's coming, and we want you to take care of yourselves however you need to during today's presentation. We are recording today's call. It will go up on our website. So if for any reason you need to step away from your computer for a moment, you are welcome to do so. You won't miss out on anything. It's all available to you later. Lastly, we really want to make sure to make room at the top of our call to name that services are not provided in a vacuum. Budgets absolutely do impact the ability to provide services to survivors. And we understand that not everybody, or excuse me, not every survivor is able to access the services they might want or need right now as it is. Specifically, there have been a couple big budget influences during the report period, which primarily looks at 2022 to 2024. And those include recent, really dramatic cuts from the federal government to VOCA funding. That's Victim of Crimes Act funding. And there was also a growth in local state funding that has sort of shifted the balance of resources for different organizations. This report does not have the sort of scope to conduct a formal budget evaluation. That's not something we touch on, but we are confident in our assessment that VOCA cuts have disproportionately impacted our colleagues who do work in the sexual assault services field, and that has absolutely shaped their sort of client capacity over time and certainly during the report period. That threat to to VOCA funding in particular is something that continues to really shape our field even today. You'll see here on the screen an example of a notice from the Attorney General's office just 2 months ago here in Illinois. The federal government recently issued some unacceptable guidelines that said VOCA funding will only be available to states that comply with the federal government's aggressive recent immigration enforcement procedures. And so Illinois, among several other states, sued the federal government to protect those dollars and say that that is not a reasonable limit to impose on VOCA funding. You'll see here $54 million in Illinois annually are on the line. And so that is a big ongoing threat and certainly a piece of the puzzle that we have to hold in our minds as we look at the trends related to services. Lastly, before I hand things off to my colleague Imuna, we would be remiss to jump into all these numbers without saying thank you. First and foremost, thank you to every survivor who participated in our interview process. We really truly believe that these reports would fail to tell us the whole story, to give us that full picture without their voices. They remain anonymous for their safety, but if you only have 10 minutes today to look at the report, we would recommend looking at the executive summary and those survivor stories. Together, they're going to give you a really robust sense of what the contents of this report are, and I think will maintain that human element of what we're talking about today. We also, of course, have to say thank you to every provider in the room, every provider who was doing good work that was recorded in InfoNet. We know that your expertise, your passion, and creativity have allowed an incredible reach to survivors across the state, ensuring that they access trauma-informed care and supportive services that they deserve. And of course, not only doing that work, but recording that work allows us to do this work of reporting on our service environment. So really, your work is the foundation of this report, and we owe you a big, big thank you. All of that said and out of the way, I will pass it over to my colleague Imuna to talk to us a little bit about domestic violence services and clients.
Thank you, Shelby. Hi, everyone. So in this section, we're going to talk about domestic violence clients demographics, as well as the services that domestic violence clients receive in 2024. When thinking about client demographics, it's important to look at them in a way that allows us to assess the reach that we have to survivors and to assess whether or not we are reaching the diverse set of survivors that exist, including in communities where gender-based violence is at the highest risk. And also looking at client demographics can help inform whether or not services are being advertised in places that reach survivors where they need them most, and also help us consider how we can make services more accessible to survivors in the future. When looking at gender and sexuality demographics, we know that the majority of clients, around 83%, are female, while around 16% are male, and then 1% are transgender, gender nonconforming, or some other identity that hasn't been disclosed. We also know that the majority of clients are straight, around 93%. 4% are bisexual, 2% identify as gay or lesbian, and then 2% identify as queer or some other identity. When we look at gender and sexuality as a whole, we see that around 5.6% of all clients identify as LGBTQ+. We also know that the majority of domestic violence clients in 2024 were people of color, around 55%, though the largest plurality of clients were white at 44%. We see that Black and Latino clients were overrepresented relative to their Illinois populations. Black clients made up around 30%, and then Latino clients made up around 21%. We also see that a significant number of clients were non-English language speakers and needed non-English language services. The majority of those non-English language speakers were Spanish, around 80%, but a significant amount were also Arabic, Polish, Korean, or Mongolian. We know that around 5,000 clients in general received services in non-English languages. Around half of clients were between 20 to 39 years old. And we see that the most common age group was 30 to 39, where almost 15,000 clients were amongst that age group. But we also know that around 7,500 clients were younger than the age of 19, and around 7,500 clients were older than the age of 50. When looking at education, we see that a slight majority, around 52%, had no formal education beyond a high school degree. We see that almost a third of clients had some college education, and then around 20% had a college graduate degree or more. When looking at parenting and marital status, the majority of clients, around 71%, have dependents, while 29% did not have dependents. The majority of clients, around 54%, were single. Almost a third of clients were married, and 11% of clients were divorced. So when we're looking at the average client, we can say that they are a single parent with dependents. We know that the majority of survivors have one dependent, but many survivors have more than one. And understanding survivors' parenting, custodial, and marital status gives us a really important insight into their needs. For example, a married survivor may need a divorce attorney, and a parenting survivor may need shelter for 4 people, not just one. If that parent is receiving therapy, they may be looking for therapy for themselves and their children. When we keep these demographics in line, they help us understand the trends and services we'll encounter later in the presentation, and they help us ensure we are meeting the wide range of needs that survivors have. We also know that many survivors have disabilities. The most common disability that survivors had was a hearing impairment, but survivors also had immobility issues, visual impairment issues, special dietary restrictions. They might need medicine administered or require a wheelchair. We know that when people have disabilities, they are often excluded from spaces because those spaces are not made accessible to them. So it's important to know the type of disabilities that survivors need assistance with to ensure that no survivor is being turned away from service because their needs are not being accommodated. We had the fortune to interview Monica, a survivor who was graceful enough to tell us her story about navigating domestic violence survivorship while also having a disability. Monica is a Black woman and the survivor of 2 domestic violence relationships. The first was with a woman who was incessantly controlling of her choices, travel, social circle, finances, and intimacy. The second was with a man who was extremely physically violent to the extent that she was permanently disabled, needing routine cortisol shots and mobility aids to walk. Monica was seen by dozens of doctors to treat her injuries during the course of this relationship and was never explicitly asked about domestic violence or offered resources. While she is glad doctors now screen for domestic violence, she is deeply hurt that she was not spared some of her pain by getting help sooner. Reflecting on the doctors who had seen her before and likely knew she was experiencing domestic violence, she said, What's understood does not always need to be explained. Doctors could have said something a million times. They could have saved me so much harm. Where was their compassion? We are all humans. Monica fled to Illinois after an incident that broke her jaw. Her first experience with shelter was very upsetting. Staff moved quickly, failed to show her empathy, and didn't offer any accommodations. But she was moved to another shelter not long after, where she was glad to find she was in kinder hands. Then, she said, I was connected to Sarah's Inn. It was the best thing that has ever happened to me. I hold them in the highest praise. They changed my whole life. Staff made accommodations for a disability without her needing to ask and connected her to a range of resources. She said, my legs were hurting so badly, I couldn't go downstairs because it hurt. They called me to the office and offered to give the first floor room. I think I cried. It was the first time someone saw me, and I didn't even have a black eye. They gave me leg braces, shower chairs, and I was able to participate more because it was easier to get to the space. Monica's therapist ultimately connected her to a rapid rehousing program, where she was given a safe place to live and heal. When asked if she had advice for other survivors who might be facing what she was going through, she told the network, take your time with the anger, the tears. Then, when you're ready, let that stuff go. Love yourself the most. So we see from Monica's own words that when services take into account survivors' disability status and provide them with the necessary accommodations that they need, it can be life-altering. We know that survivors experience multiple forms of violence. When survivors do intake, they are asked about their primary presenting violence. This is the data that you see here. It is not a reflection of the full range of violence clients are facing. What it is more accurately a reflection of is the type of violence that drove a client to seek services, or the type of violence that they see are the most salient form of violence in their current relationship dynamic. We see that there is a nearly 50-50 split between physical and emotional domestic violence, while a much smaller subset of clients says that sexual domestic violence is the primary presenting violence. But we know that survivors often experience multiple types of violence and can experience these three violences at once, and that affects the services that they seek. So speaking of services, we're now going to discuss the type of services that survivors received in 2024, and talk a little bit about the services that were most popular and those trends. In 2024, domestic violence programs provided an outstanding 617,000 hours of direct services across more than 53,000 client cases in the state of Illinois. A small proportion of client cases may be duplicates. In this report, we abbreviate client cases to clients to account for those duplicates, but it is not a significant amount of cases. We also know that 165,000 survivors received information and referrals through brief services. That's a 95% increase, almost double from 2023. When we look at the proportion of survivors that are adults and minors, we see that 84% of clients are adults and 16% of clients are children. These more than 53,000 client cases reflect a 3% increase in caseload from 2023. This is part of a years-long post-COVID recovery in service capacity. We can see in 2020 that service capacity decreased significantly, likely due to COVID restrictions like lockdown that impeded survivors from getting the services that they need. Since 2020, we can see a steady increase in services, but in cases, but cases still remain around 5% lower than the pre-pandemic service total in 2019. In looking at this map of services by location, we would like to make clear that the map reflects the number of clients that providers in each region were able to reach. It does not reflect the quantity of survivors that exist in these regions. We know that survivors live everywhere. These numbers reflect the capacity of different regions and their ability to find in-service service survivors, but not necessarily the amount of survivors that need help in those areas. We know that Cook County served the largest amount of clients, nearly 21,000, followed by Central Illinois, the Collar counties, then Southern Illinois, and Northern Illinois. We also are able to break down client cases by zip code in Chicago. This map and the following map cover where survivors are from, when they receive services in the city. We'd like to make clear again that not all survivors receiving services are represented here. These are only services recorded in InfoNet. And InfoNet, to protect survivor confidentiality, aggregates data and makes data confidential when there are less than 9 cases in a category. To reflect those cases where there are less than 9, but we don't know how many, we have a 1 to 9 category to make it clear that that data was restricted. We can compare the zip code map to the caller map from the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline report to see if services are reaching the areas where the most need is articulated. And when we do compare those maps, we see that some of the highest client density zip codes in this client served map correlate with some of the highest contact zip codes in the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline map, indicating that there is an organizational response to the high needs articulated in these areas. The highest client density zip codes in Chicago in 2024 were 60629, 60632, and 60617. We also have a new map for you. This is a map of clients served in Chicago by ward. We can use this information to communicate about services with local elected officials by analyzing it at the ward level. Again, wards that contain zip codes whose client totals were withheld by InfoNet for confidentiality reasons are flagged as known underestimates. And we see that the highest client density wards are the 15th ward, the 17th ward, the 16th ward. We would also like to highlight that this map was created with data at the precinct level, at the zip code level, not the precinct or ward level, meaning that there may be duplicates because some wards share zip codes. But again, these duplicates are not significant and should not affect the map severely. But we do see that the wards with the highest density coincide with the zip codes with the highest density, and also with areas in the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline where calls were the most numerous. In the report, we highlight domestic violence services provided almost 35 unique forms of service for clients across the state. In the report, we details these services by category, and then we talk about trends that we see in these categories. For the purposes of this presentation, we chose the top 10 domestic violence services to highlight to you, to show a summary of what types of services were popular and sought out by clients. Legal advocacy services was the most widely provided service. It went to 46% of all clients. That is a category, and you can see the evidence of that in the specific service, civil legal advocacy, which had 23,700 clients in 2024. Some of the other more popular services received by clients were in-person counseling, telephone counseling, collaborative case management, other types of advocacy, shelter services, transportation, and economic assistance. Many of the top 10 services received by clients align with the top needs articulated by survivors contacting the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline for help in 2024. These are services like domestic violence shelter, legal advocacy, affordable housing, emotional support and counseling, etc. But while these services are closely aligned, they are not always aligned in scale. For example, domestic violence shelter was the top need among contacts to the hotline in 2024. Almost 19,000 survivors contacted the hotline in the state requesting domestic violence shelter. However, during that same time, only 8,000 survivors actually received shelter. This reflects the different nature of the hotline and the InfoNet data. Survivors can call the hotline multiple times to request shelter, while client cases reflect one client at a time receiving shelter. And so what you're seeing here is that multiple clients can call the hotline receiving shelter, but ultimately a fraction of those clients actually receive them. In 2024, domestic violence providers provided a range of housing services. 8,000 clients received shelter services, both on and off-site shelter. Nearly 1,500 clients received transitional housing. 5,000 clients received housing and advocacy services. And we can see that the amount of services provided varies by region. For example, Central Illinois led the state in on-site shelter services, while the collar counties led in the provision of off-site shelter services. And Cook County led in the provision of transitional housing services. In this graph, you can see again that there is a bottleneck happening when it comes to service shelter requests versus the amount of clients that can be sheltered. The average days of shelter per client grew about 15% in 2024, from 58 in 2023 to 65 in 2024. Yet at the same time, shelter turnaways increased 42%. As more survivors receive shelter and they stay in shelters for longer, it also results in more turnaways. So we see the importance of increasing shelter capacity so that no survivor is being turned away from a service that is crucial for their survival. Legal system services is another category of services that appears in the report. Between 2022 and 2024, there was a 17% increase in clients who received legal advocacy services outside of orders of protections, and a 42% increase in hours spent on these services, demonstrating the complexity of legal cases. In 2024, 80% of OPs filed were granted, indicating that attorneys and advocates are navigating these complex issues successfully and ensuring survivors have safety measures in place to assist them. Counseling services is another category of service provided to survivors. In 2024, counseling service continued to be the second most provided service to clients amongst programs. There was a 4% increase for in-person counseling and a slight decrease in telephone counseling compared to 2023. This is likely a reflect of that shift related to the lifting of COVID-era restrictions. People need less telehealth counseling and more in-person counseling. Margaret is a survivor of multiple types of abuse who received DB therapy and told us her story about how it helped her greatly. Margaret is a white woman and survivor of both child sexual abuse and domestic abuse as an adult. After meeting a man online using a dating app, she quickly grew concerned about his overwhelming and demanding behavior. She said, quote, "It felt like my organs were on my skin, on the outside. I was happy to meet someone, but it didn't feel right." After concluding that his actions were, quote, "possessive, derogatory, and mean-spirited," she broke up with him and had a friend help her return his belongings. She said, "He went nuts. He screamed my name, banged on the door, and called repeatedly. He stalked her long after she ended the relationship." While grappling with the fear of being stalked, she also struggled with body memories of her childhood abuse. She turned to Between Friends for help, working with a domestic violence therapist in individual and group settings. She had seen many therapists on and off throughout her life, but Margaret told the network that working with a therapist trained in domestic violence made a massive difference, connecting the dots between different forms of gender-based violence that have shaped her life. She said, "The baseline with Between Friends was different because I felt like it was an opportunity to review all the different experiences I've had in a new light. I'm coming to understand that suffering is suffering. There's no need to compare what happened to me with what happened to others. My history of abuse was honored in a different way." Healing is a long road, but Margaret spoke highly of her ongoing domestic violence services. She said that they have helped her understand herself better and make peace with the things she had judged herself for in the past. She said, quote, "The things that comes up for me is how the experiences from my childhood have colored all my relationships with men without me noticing the impact. I have not had healthy male relationships, and that is what I wanted most. It feels like a kaleidoscope, clicking in new places of information and seeing the world differently." When looking at economic and life skill services, we saw an increase in transportation and economic assistance to clients that could be related to two programs operated by the network during that period. The RTA Survivor Transportation Pilot Program is a program in which domestic violence clients were able to receive venture cards through their domestic violence providers that allowed them to go to work, into class, into school, into appointments without having to worry about the cost. We also saw an expansion of the Survivor Fund, a one-time $1,000 payment to survivors where they can use it to their discretion. Child and teen services is another category of services that clients received. It consists predominantly of counseling services. Trends in child and family counseling follow trends of other forms of counseling, but we see that the category has the most variance in trends among the service categories, and that may reflect a limit or strain on resources for youth counseling. Counseling services are the place where they're most likely to see decreases or stagnation because of a limit in funding and clinicians. Now I'm going to pass it to Shelby so she can talk about sexual assault clients and their services.
Thanks, Imuna. Just as Imuna said, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about those sexual assault services and clients. One thing we want to offer as a point of distinction here is that, of course, we know that all forms of violence, including sexual violence, may occur inside of a domestic violence relationship. Our providers, kind of by nature of needing to organize the work they do, have been separated into domestic violence and sexual assault services. Some providers are known as dual providers and provide both DV and SA services, whereas others kind of specialize. And so somebody who's experienced sexual assault in the context of an intimate partner relationship may choose to seek services from a rape crisis center, which would fall into a sexual assault organization, or they might go to a domestic violence organization. They might even receive two different kinds of specialized services, one from each place. So we know that these are somewhat artificial lines, but just to offer a little perspective on kind of what the differences are there between the orgs that we're talking about. As we turn to talking about our sexual assault clients, we'll see that in many ways they're quite similar to domestic violence services clients. I'll call out some of the places that we do notice significant differences. But when folks report their gender identity, the vast majority do identify as female, about 84%, with 13% identifying as male and 3% reporting an identity that is transgender or gender nonconforming in some way. When we look at sexual orientation, we see that 80% of folks who chose to report, which is relatively low, identified as straight, and another 20% fell into some kind of LGBTQ identity, be it bisexual, gay or lesbian, or some other queer identity. Something we want to note about the gender and sexuality of SA clients is that compared to the population in Illinois, our LGBTQ community members are significantly overrepresented. And that is really promising alignment with what we understand about the risk of violence in the queer community. Let me tell you what I mean. We know that LGBTQ people are much more likely to experience gender-based violence than their non-queer peers. And we also would then expect a need for more of them to be in our service environment to get the support they deserve. If we look at that trans category, for example, here on our gender pie chart, you'll see that it says 3%, which might sound kind of small, but that's actually 6 times the proportion of the estimated Illinois population. So it is a disproportionately high rate in this identity category. This reflects very well on our sexual assault services providers who've clearly made positive inroads in our LGBTQ communities to make sure that queer survivors are getting the support they deserve. And we think that that's a really promising piece of information that comes out of this demographic data. When we look at race, ethnicity, and language data, we'll see here that the largest racial identity amongst clients is that white non-Latino identity at 53%, just over half of clients, with another fifth of clients identifying as Hispanic or Latino, and another fifth identifying as Black or African American. Just as an FYI, all of our race data is in mutually exclusive categories. So that means that if I were to be a biracial survivor, perhaps I would indicate white and Black on my form. In the purposes of this chart, you would be in that multiple races bucket. So that's how we have this data organized here today for your review. When we look at languages, as Imuna mentioned earlier, we know that survivors need access to services in a number of languages, and there were hundreds of clients seeking sexual assault services in 2024 in non-English languages. Specifically, 10 languages emerged as non-English language needs. Though the vast majority of those were Spanish speakers, 93% of the nearly 500 clients were seeking services in Spanish. This really reminds us of the importance of having bilingual staff wherever possible, and of course, having access to interpretation services so that language is never a barrier to accessing support when you need it. When we look at age and education level, we see perhaps the biggest difference in the SA versus DV client population, and that is that the clients in sexual assault services tend to skew much younger. You'll see here that fully a third of clients are actually minors. They're, 19 and under in this age category. And similarly, then we see that a third of clients are in K through 12 education when they're connecting with providers, alongside another third or so who are in college at the time of service. This is a really important reflection of the hard work that is done both in prevention and intervention services in that school setting. And it reflects that we're appropriately connecting these young people to resources when they need them. As Imuna mentioned as well, we know that this primary presenting violence type reflects sort of the most salient form of violence that brings someone to services. It is not a reflection of all forms of violence that someone experiences. When it comes to the sexual assault client intake, we see that about half of all clients are coming in related to an experience of sexual assault or abuse in adulthood. And more than a third are coming in with experiences related to child sexual abuse or assault. One of the many folks that we had the honor of interviewing was a survivor who goes by the pseudonym Robin. And he shared with us the way in which child sexual abuse shaped his whole life well into adulthood, the ways in which he navigated that, and the tools that he's used to support himself in that process, both services and art. And we'd like to share his story with you now. Robin is a gender nonconforming, mixed-race survivor of child sexual abuse. His abuse lasted for almost a decade at the hands of a family member's boyfriend. As a child, you don't have the language, he told the network in his interview, but you know when something is wrong. He points to abuse as the source of many disabling conditions and mental health issues he faced, including a personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, challenges emotionally regulating in everyday life, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. He shared that the abuse has shaped all of his future relationships and makes him feel vulnerable to other forms of harm, things like sexual partners being forceful or degrading or removing protection without consent. The abuse ended not long after Robin's first period, when he was driven to tell someone out of fear of becoming pregnant. He disclosed to a friend at school who remains an important part of his support system, and that led to a DCFS investigation. The investigation was closed without an indication, and there were no criminal charges ever pressed, but it forever impacted his family dynamics. He told the network, "I don't want $1 million or shiny gifts or food. I want to hug my family again. I want them to say sorry. I want them to say they believe me." Robin was connected to counseling at a center for child sexual abuse survivors for several years and attributes that therapy to being a complicated part of his healing journey. "My therapist was integral to my healing, but also failed to take appropriate action when Robin expressed suicidal ideation during a session. A kind stranger helped to save his life that day instead, and since then, his care has been transferred to a Black therapist at a different nonprofit who he feels better understands him. As an adult, Robin works with other vulnerable youth, and has brought his experience to each child he meets, even when others deem them difficult, telling them, "You are not a problem. You're a child having a problem." He's also an artist, and he uses poetry as a foundation of his healing journey as well. I write poetry for every fat girl, black girl, and brown girl who was ever told she couldn't speak. With Robin's voice in mind and that range of tools that he alone offered us in the ways in which we might lean on others for healing, let's talk a little bit about what sexual assault services look like in Illinois. Overall, in 2024, sexual assault programs provided a remarkable almost 106,000 hours of direct services across just under 10,000 client cases in the state of Illinois. You've already heard that there are some duplicates in that number, and that we abbreviate the term to clients for brevity throughout the report. But in addition to that almost 10,000 client count, another 150,000 survivors received information and referrals through brief services. When we say brief services, we mean it's a one-time interaction, likely on a hotline or in a walk-in setting, whereas a client is going to be somebody you have an ongoing relationship with. There is an important caveat with this data in particular, outside of course, the reminder that not all sexual assault service providers use InfoNet and therefore aren't reflected here, is also that child advocacy centers, CACs, are also not represented here. Those organizations provide a lot of service to child survivors of sexual assault as well. They just happen to record their data in a different part of InfoNet, and that data is not something that we are working with and looking at today. So you can sort of consider this an extra underestimate from that perspective. When we look at those clients who did receive services, we can see that it was about 2/3 of them as adults and another third who were children. When we take a look at this trend chart, you'll see it kind of starts the same as that domestic violence chart, right? We see there was a really dramatic impact during 2020 related to COVID. However, unlike domestic violence services, which we've started to see steadily moving back up as they've reached capacity over time, capacity in our sexual assault services has struggled, has decreased. And we think that that is very concretely tied to the dramatic cut in funding. And what we would offer is that this is a very modest decrease in services relative to a dramatic decrease in funding. We think the fact that nearly 10,000 survivors were able to access services in 2024 is a reflection of our partners' resilience and their incredible efficacy in reaching people, even with those increasingly limited resources. You've seen similar maps to these before. We'll touch on them quickly. As you know, not all survivors receiving services are represented here. This is the folks who report living in a Chicago zip code when they are receiving services from a sexual assault organization. They are provided in aggregate, and those total clients who are withheld by zip code due to confidentiality are included in that 1 through 9 category, that lowest amount. And what we can see here is that there's definitely an element of client density in the southwest side of the city. You'll see the highest client density zips are 60629, 60623, and 60632, many of which also closely align with the highest client density for domestic violence services. Using that zip code information, we're pleased to be able to provide a new ward map as well. And this can be used to advocate and communicate with our local elected officials about access to services. This, as Imuna mentioned to us, is related to the zip codes and which zip codes overlap with wards. Of course, they don't align perfectly. So we know that there is a bit of duplication in this map, but it definitely still tells us a clear story about where folks are and are not able to receive services. Our highest client density wards are Ward 15, 18, and 12. There are a wide range of services related to sexual assault as well. At least 10 unique forms of service are provided in InfoNet. We've listed the top 5 here. They are also organized by category in the report, and we just touch on some trends, not all of them. We also do talk much more in detail in the report about analyzing hours of service. And that can be really insightful because we know that often those services that reach the most people can be quite flashy. But the services that don't get to go to a lot of people because they are very time and resource intensive are also really important. Those long-term clinical or legal services. And so there's a good mix in the report to refer to if you're curious. You'll see here that our top 5 sexual assault services include general advocacy, almost immediately followed by in-person counseling services, both of which went to about 42% of clients. Then telephone counseling, medical advocacy, and criminal justice advocacy. When we take a look at advocacy services, you'll see there are largely downward trends. However, we want to note that there's been a really remarkable increase in medical advocacy capacity in the last few years, a 5% increase in clients and a 12% increase in hours. We want to remind folks that it is incredibly well documented the efficacy of sexual assault advocacy services and the importance of being able to maintain these services over time. Law enforcement are more likely to accept a report from somebody who has an advocate, and survivors with advocates are more likely to receive comprehensive medical care. Counseling, we see here a similar sort of strain on our counseling resources as we did in DV, but we will flag that group counseling services actually maintained a pretty stable rate of service, just a 1% decrease. And that group counseling is really important because as our capacity to provide in-person individual counseling shrinks potentially, that group counseling can give somebody an alternative space to still express themselves and receive support. That can happen at a much larger ratio of provider to client. Lastly, some other services that don't fit neatly into those categories include parent-guardian consultations and legal services from an attorney. Because so many minors receive sexual assault services, we often have to partner with their parents to talk about their progress and their well-being. Those are what those consultations are. You'll see that legal services from an attorney have sort of stagnated a little bit. They were actually part of a 3-year increase in services capacity until 2024. And that had been sort of tied in our minds anyway to the increase in ARPA dollars that went to legal aid agencies in the city of Chicago. However, as that budget gap grows and as our ARPA dollars end this year, it's likely that some of that progress we were able to make with client capacity will be halted and stagnated if we aren't able to fill in with other funding. I know this was a lot of information. We are rapidly closing on the end of our time together, and we have a little bit of time for questions in just a moment. But we wanted to kind of sum up why we walked you through all these numbers and stories today. And that is because we really see this report as a celebration of domestic violence and sexual assault services, their life-saving work. And we hope that it's a tool for all of the providers in our community to demonstrate the impact of their reach. It also identifies needs that are currently going unmet. We know that need way outmatches capacity inside of our current service sector. And as such, we hope that this report also serves as a call to public and private stakeholders to invest in these essential services. I'm going to close with one final story from one of our interviewees who really shows us the importance of this wide range of services, and then we'll open the floor to any questions. This is why services matter. Gia is a Latina woman and a survivor of both child sexual abuse and adult domestic violence, including emotional, financial, physical, and sexual abuse. Domestic violence shaped the lives of many of Gia's family members, which she says warped her sense of love. I thought of love as something you had to earn, she told the network. Reflecting on her time with an ex-boyfriend, she said it was 8 months of hell. She detailed how the violence escalated from insulting her body and reviewing her phone every night to interfering with her work and school schedule to later forcing her into sexual activity. The on again, off again nature of their relationship made her feel isolated from her loved ones. They would say, "You're still with him after he kicked you out?" No one ever asked, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" After she left him, he harassed her for several months, and her mental health rapidly deteriorated, leading to an attempt to end her life. One day, I dropped out of school, quit my job, got a pixie cut, and took all of my brother's antidepressant pills. She spent weeks afterwards receiving intensive mental health treatment and relearning to walk and talk. Since her breaking point, Gia has worked with an army of service providers to meet her needs. She shared her survivor status with her university, which was taxing, but she was provided in turn with emergency housing and a scholarship. Back in school, she began gaining the language she needed to describe her own experience, telling us that in a psych class, she learned all the stuff she'd experienced had a name. It felt liberating to know what domestic violence was. She's worked with at least 5 organizations to receive financial and rental assistance to make ends meet, and another program for counseling services. No single organization has been able to meet her needs. They've not had the capacity, but the network of supportive services has allowed Gia to know that her future will be brighter. At the time of her interview, she was days away from graduating with her hard-won bachelor's degree. With that, we invite you all to join us at our community feedback session in December. Those of you who are members, anyone who would like to access this report in full can do so on our website, and we are grateful for your time. Any questions you have would be welcome via email. And we are so grateful to have you all here together for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So thank you for joining us for today's launch.